Welcome, dreamers. Have you ever wondered, what if you woke up in another man's body? Not just any man, but a butcher, with blood on his hands and hunger in his veins. Tonight you will step into the life of Peter Baker, a man trapped in the flesh of Jackson the Butcher after a cruel mistake of fate. This is not just a story, it's a journey into identity, truth, and the haunting cost of living a borrowed life. But first, can you write in the comment where you are listening this from and what time is over there? Now, let's the adventures begin. It all begins one October day, carried with it a bone-deep chill. But in your mind, there was nothing but absolute darkness. No sensation of flesh, no sound, not even the steady rhythm of a heartbeat. What remained was only a floating void where every thought stretched thin, like a dim reflection on glass. The last clear memory was simple. You had been standing on the street, basket of apples in hand, when a stabbing pain pierced your chest. The world tilted. You collapsed. Faces blurred with alarm surrounded you. Voices shouted, but they melted into silence. And then there was nothing. When you opened your eyes again, the sky was gone. The pavement was gone. Even the noise of traffic had vanished. In their place was a hall, vast and white, stretching endlessly in every direction. Rows upon rows of filing cabinets lined the walls like cold sentinels. The light had no source, yet shone with an unyielding brightness, coating everything in an almost metallic sheen. The only sound was the rattle of keyboards. Hundreds of clerks, dressed identically in black, sat at long desks, eyes fixed on their glowing screens, fingers striking keys with mechanical precision. None looked up, none spoke. You began to walk, though your footsteps had no sound. The sensation was unnerving, weightless, as though gravity had loosened its grip. Your heart pounded, though the rhythm existed only in memory. Every movement confirmed the same truth. You were no longer part of the world you had known. At the far end of the corridor, a man appeared. He was tall, spare, silver-haired, cloaked in a long coat that seemed to carry authority in its folds. His eyes, cold, penetrating, met yours with a gaze that seemed to strip you bare. In that instant, you understood. This was not the world of the living. This was some other domain, a bureau of the metaphysical, a place where destiny operated like an immense machine. And you, Peter Baker, were nothing more than a file misplaced on its conveyor belt. The silver-haired man lifted a hand, and a thick dossier materialized from the air. He flipped through its pages briskly until he stopped. His lips pressed into a thin line, as if recognizing a mistake too grave for words. His voice did not echo in the air, but resonated directly in your mind. Dry, metallic, final. There had been an error. Your name, Peter Baker, had been entered by mistake into the Book of the Dead. Your death was the result of a clerical slip. The ground beneath you seemed to fall away. Blood froze in your veins. A life extinguished by nothing more than a misstroke of a key? Rage swelled. You wanted to scream, to pound the endless floor until the universe corrected itself. Yet the vast chamber absorbed every outburst. The clerks never turned their heads. The mechanical clatter of their typing drowned you out. The man continued without hesitation. The error could not be undone. Your body had ceased. The gates of nature had closed, and nothing, no will, no appeal, could open them again. Still, you were to be compensated. You could choose, dissolve entirely into the void, or inhabit another body that had just been abandoned. The choice hollowed you. Thoughts of Helen filled you, her face weathered with love and years shared. Thoughts of Mark, the son who carried his burdens with stubborn pride. Thoughts of the granddaughter whose laughter still echoed in your chest. All of them still alive, yet none of them could hear you. No words could reach anyone. The silver-haired man turned a page and another name appeared. Jackson, a butcher of the town. He had collapsed from a heart attack at the market. His body, still warm, lacked only a soul. The decision was offered with the same indifference as a clerk stamping a form. If you refused, you would vanish. If you accepted, you would live, but inside the butcher. Your mind reeled. To exist in another man's skin or not at all. But before you could protest, the chamber around you convulsed. The white walls warped. The floor dissolved. Invisible cords lashed at you, dragging, binding, forcing you downward. The pull tightened. You struggled, but each resistance only drew the bonds tighter. A silent detonation struck, and you plummeted into blackness. When light returned, it was blinding. A rank stench of blood, of charred fat, of old smoke invaded your lungs. You coughed violently, tried to raise a hand, only to find it was not your own. Broad, calloused, veined, stained with work. Your chest heaved under the weight of a protruding gut. Before you stood a cracked mirror. Staring back was not Peter, not the man Helen had kissed each morning, not the father Mark had known. Instead, a square jaw, sagging skin, gray stubble, dull eyes. Jackson. The butcher's body had become your prison. The first movement was agony. Joints popped like rusted hinges. The heartbeat in your chest thudded irregular, heavy, foreign. Breath rasped through a throat not your own, lips chapped and raw. You staggered toward the door, into the daylight of the market street. People turned as you passed. Whispers darted between them. Jackson had been dead, yet here he was, lumbering through the stalls. Faces recoiled, eyes widened. Some whispered curses, some stared in awe. You ignored them, forcing each footstep forward. The body resisted, weighed down by decades of indulgence and labor. Muscles knotted with memory dragged you toward the habits of another life, toward knives, toward drink, toward rage. Still, you pressed on, drawn by one compass alone, home. The house appeared, familiar and heartbreaking. Weathered wood, a porch sagging under years, the apple trees beyond. For a long moment you stood at the gate, trembling. Your hand, coarse and alien, closed on the handle. The door creaked open. Inside, Helen turned. Her face went pale. The dish towel fell from her hand. In her eyes was not recognition, but horror. A butcher had stepped into her home. You wanted to run to her, to assure her, but what emerged from your throat was not your voice. It was a guttural rasp, a stranger's growl. She flinched, retreating. The house you had built felt suddenly hostile. Every photograph on the wall mocked you. Peter at the orchard, Peter on his wedding day, Peter holding his infant son, proofs of a life denied. Jackson appeared from the back room. His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowed. To him you were not father, but interloper. His stare was sharp, guarded, suspicious. The bond of blood severed in an instant. Then the child. She toddled into the hall, doll in her arms. Her gaze lifted to your face, and terror lit her eyes. She screamed, clutched the doll tighter, and fled into her mother's arms. That cry tore through you more than any chain of the bureau. It was then you knew this salvation was no mercy. It was a curse. You sank into the old armchair, the one molded by years of your weight. The frame groaned beneath Jackson's bulk. The room, once warm, glared at you with alien brightness. Every detail, the pictures, the furniture, the faint smell of apples, stood as reminders of what was lost. Outside, the wind picked up, scattering leaves across the porch. In the rustling came a faint, mocking laugh. You felt it inside, the echo of Jackson's soul still clinging to the body, sneering at your despair. And so the truth settled. You had not returned. You had been sentenced to a new exile, living among those you loved, yet forever estranged, inhabiting flesh that carried another man's life. The first battle had ended, but the war, you realized, was only beginning. Morning came heavy, not with the tenderness of sunlight on familiar skin, but with the oppressive weight of a body that did not belong to you. When you opened your eyes, the world appeared blurred through lids swollen from a stranger's life. The smell of old tobacco clung to the room, and your breath rattled with the residue of nights soaked in alcohol. You rose from the bed, your bed, or at least the bed that now recognized Jackson's bulk rather than Peter's lean frame. The floor creaked under the weight of your new form, boards groaning as though disapproving. Each movement reminded you of the theft that had occurred. The bones you carried were not carved by your own life, but by another man's years of gluttony and work. Helen stood at the stove, her back to you. The sound of oil crackling filled the kitchen. For a moment, you allowed yourself to imagine that everything was normal, that if you spoke her name, she would turn with the same warmth she always had. But when she finally did look at you, her eyes reflected the truth. A butcher stood in the place of her husband. She said nothing, but the silence was sharper than any words. It was not merely the absence of sound, but the presence of distance. Her gaze lowered to the floor, her hands trembled slightly, and the pan hissed louder, as if to cover her unease. You sat heavily at the table. The chair groaned under Jackson's weight. The wood remembered Peter's lighter frame, his careful posture, his quiet habits. Now it resisted. You stared at your hands on the table, thick, veined, scarred from years of cleavers and carcasses. These were not hands that once harvested apples from your orchard, nor the hands that had held Helen's gently on summer evenings. These were instruments of another life, stained by work you had never done. The food was set before you, but when you tried to eat, the instincts of Jackson's flesh guided you. Your body craved heavy portions, large bites, meat rather than the modest bread and fruit you had once preferred. You forced yourself to eat slowly, but even then, grease clung to your lips, and the taste of salt and fat coated your tongue. You could feel Helen's gaze flicker toward you, then away again, each glance like a blade reminding her that the man across from her was both husband and stranger. When Mark entered, the air thickened. He paused in the doorway, eyes narrowing at the sight of you seated at his father's table. His lips pressed into a thin line, jaw tight, shoulders squared as though preparing for confrontation. Though he said nothing, the verdict was in his stare. The man he had once called father no longer sat before him. Only Jackson, the butcher, remained. You wanted to speak, to insist that it was still you, but your voice betrayed you. The sound was rough, gravelly, alien. Words that might have once carried authority and love now emerged like growls. Mark turned his head away, unable to bear it. The granddaughter peeked around the corner, doll pressed to her chest. Her eyes widened in fear, and she retreated immediately, her small footsteps echoing down the hall. The sound of her crying reached you moments later, piercing sharper than any accusation. Thus began your existence as a shadow in your own home. The body itself became your greatest enemy. It betrayed you at every turn. When you tried to lift the watering can to tend the apple trees, your grip crushed the handle too roughly, and water spilled across the soil. When you attempted to write in the old leather notebook where you had once recorded thoughts and weather patterns, your hands cramped around the pen, producing only jagged lines. Even your breathing was not your own. Each inhale rasped, each exhale wheezed. Nights were restless, your chest rising and falling with the burden of decades you had not lived. Sleep came heavy and broken, filled with dreams of cleavers striking bone, of cattle lowing, of beer foaming over cracked mugs. Neighbors passed you in the street with suspicion. Once they had greeted Peter Baker with nods, polite words, occasional smiles. Now they muttered under their breath, whispering about resurrection, about the butcher walking again. Some made the sign of the cross, others crossed the street altogether. No one saw Peter anymore. They only saw Jackson, returned from death. Helen tried to carry on. She served meals, washed clothes, tended the garden. But in every movement, her distance grew. Her eyes lingered on you only long enough to confirm what she already feared. Peter's soul might still be there, but Jackson's shadow was stronger. At night, she lay stiff beside you. The warmth that once passed between you in quiet gestures was gone. You longed to reach for her, but your coarse arms held you back. Even if you touched her, would she feel her husband's tenderness or a butcher's intrusion? One evening, as you sat by the window, you caught her reflection in the glass. She was watching you, tears glistening in her eyes. She quickly turned away when she noticed you had seen her. That unspoken moment cut deeper than words. The child no longer approached you. Once she had run into your arms, laughing as you swung her high above the orchard grass. Now she clung to her mother's leg whenever you entered the room. Her wide eyes were filled not with recognition, but with fear. The distance between you and her seemed unbridgeable. You realized then that death had stolen more than breath from you. It had stolen your role in the eyes of those you loved. To Helen, you were half-stranger. To Mark, you were imposter. To the child, you were monster. Worse still, the body itself whispered to you. Hunger for meat rose unbidden. Thirst for beer burned in your throat. Anger flared without reason. You found yourself slamming a hand against the table one evening as Mark muttered something under his breath. The sound of wood cracking beneath your palm startled even you. Helen froze. Mark stiffened. The child burst into tears. You stared at the broad, trembling hand that had struck the table. Not Peter's hand, Jackson's. That night, in the silence of the orchard, you felt him near, Jackson. His presence lingered like smoke, his laughter curling through the branches. The words were not spoken out loud, but you heard them all the same. This is my body. You can borrow it for a while, but soon you'll be nothing more than a guest overstaying your welcome." The chill of those words sunk deep into your bones. You returned to the house, sat at the old armchair, and pressed your face into your palms. The world outside moved on, neighbors gossiping, apples ripening, winds shifting. But inside, you were unraveling. Every day you remained, Jackson grew stronger within you. Every glance from your family confirmed the same truth. You were no longer Peter Baker in their eyes. And in the quiet, with the smell of meat and beer clinging to you, you began to wonder if you even remained Peter in your own eyes. Days bled into one another, each marked by the same grim ritual. The butcher's body asserting itself, your soul resisting, your family recoiling. You began to notice subtle changes. The craving for meat no longer felt entirely foreign. When Helen served a modest stew, your body longed for slabs of roasted flesh. The thirst for beer grew stronger, a phantom ache in your throat every evening. The struggle became internal. Each temptation whispered that you were losing. The cleaver that hung in Jackson's old workshop seemed to call your hand when you passed it. You never lifted it, but you could feel the weight of its handle even without touching it. The orchard no longer felt like your sanctuary. Once among apple blossoms, you had known peace. Now, your heavy steps broke branches, your clumsy hands bruised fruit. The trees themselves seemed to mourn, leaves rustling as if whispering their disappointment. When you ventured into town, the weight of judgment followed you. Conversations halted when you approached. Whispers chased you down narrow streets. "That's not Peter," they muttered. "That's the butcher, walking again." Children pointed with frightened eyes. Mothers pulled them close. Old men shook their heads as though lamenting a curse upon the community. The pastor himself crossed the street rather than pass you directly. Once you overheard a neighbor remark, "If that's Peter, he's wearing another man's skin. And if it's Jackson, God help us." The words struck deeper than any blade. You returned home with your shoulders hunched, each step heavier. Helen's silence deepened. She no longer met your gaze when you entered a room. At meals, she kept her eyes fixed on her plate. At night, she lay turned away, her body a fortress you could not breach. You wanted to speak, to remind her of summers long past, of storms weathered together, of nights when laughter had echoed in this house. But every attempt collapsed under the voice that emerged, a guttural rasp that sounded nothing like Peter. You learned to keep quiet. Silence became your shield, though it also became your prison. Mark stopped coming home as often. He lingered at work, volunteered for extra shifts, stayed late in the garage. When he did return, he barely acknowledged you. The bond between father and son had thinned to the breaking point. Once, as he passed you in the hallway, his shoulder brushed yours. He stiffened, recoiled slightly, then muttered something under his breath. You did not ask what he said, you knew. He no longer looked for guidance, no longer sought approval. In his eyes, Peter Baker was gone. The child avoided you entirely. Her laughter filled the house only when you were absent. When you entered a room, her play stopped, her doll clutched tighter, her eyes wet with fear. Once you tried to kneel before her, to offer a gentle smile. She screamed and fled. The sound of her sobs behind a closed door echoed for hours. You sat alone afterward, staring at your hands, wondering how love could dissolve into terror so quickly. Nights grew unbearable. In the orchard, among the skeletal branches, you felt him most, Jackson. His presence pressed against you like smoke, like shadow. You never saw him clearly, but his laughter coiled in your ears. "This is my body," the voice whispered. "You may borrow it, but it bends to me. Every hunger, every rage, every weakness, it's all mine, and soon you will be gone." You tried to resist, but each day proved his claim true. When anger flared, it was Jackson's rage. When hunger gnawed, it was Jackson's appetite. Even when you closed your eyes, the dreams belonged to him. Slaughterhouses, knives, the endless smell of blood. The breaking point came at the market. A group of men stood whispering as you passed. Their laughter was sharp, cutting. One of them sneered loud enough for you to hear, "Look at him, monster in borrowed skin." The words burned. Before you realized it, your body had turned. Your hand gripped the man's collar, lifting him off the ground with ease. His face purpled, his feet kicked helplessly. The crowd shouted, horrified. Helen's cry pierced the chaos. She rushed forward, clinging to your arm, begging you to stop. Her voice trembled with terror, not only for the man, but for what you had become. You dropped him. He collapsed, gasping, while the crowd recoiled as one. In their eyes, you saw no Peter, no husband, no father, only Jackson reborn, violent and monstrous. Helen dragged you away, tears streaking her face. Her sobs that night were not of grief alone, but of despair. The dinner table fractured. Helen no longer sat across from you, but at the far end. Mark stopped attending altogether. The child ate in silence, eyes fixed on her plate. One evening, the tension snapped. Mark slammed his fist against the wall, shouting that this house was no longer his home, that his father was gone. He stormed out, the door slamming behind him. Helen buried her face in her hands. The child cried until her voice broke. You sat motionless, the weight of Jackson's body crushing you, the weight of loss crushing your soul. In the quiet of that night, you stood before the mirror. Cracks ran across its surface, distorting your reflection. Dozens of Jacksons stared back, each laughing silently. Your fists trembled, blood rose to your temples. You struck the glass. Shards fell, blood trickled from your knuckles, but the faces did not vanish. They multiplied, mocking you. You pressed your forehead against the wall, whispering to yourself that you were Peter, but the words sounded hollow even to you. Thus ended the first stage of your exile. You lived in Jackson's flesh, but piece by piece, that flesh consumed you. Your family saw a stranger. The town saw a monster. And deep within, you feared the truth. Perhaps you were no longer Peter Baker at all, but merely a ghost clinging to a body that was never yours. The tragedy had only begun.
The weeks that followed were not marked by the rhythm of days, but by the slow erosion of identity. The butcher's body grew heavier around you, its instincts sharper, its demands louder. Every morning you awoke with hunger gnawing at your gut, not for fruit or bread, but for meat dripping with grease. Your throat craved bitterness, the taste of beer lingering even when you had not touched a drop. At first, you resisted. You forced yourself to eat sparingly, to drink water, to walk among the orchard rows as Peter once had. But your steps grew clumsy. The ground trembled under your weight, and the scent of apples no longer soothed you. Even the birds seemed to avoid you. In the evenings, when the house fell into uneasy silence, you felt the presence of Jackson pressing closer. His laughter crawled along the walls, his voice echoing in your bones. "This is mine," he whispered. "Every craving, every outburst, you cannot resist forever." And you feared he was right. Helen's distance grew colder with each passing day. She no longer lingered in the same room. Her footsteps, once soft with affection, now carried the sharpness of caution. You noticed the way she avoided brushing past you, the way her shoulders stiffened whenever you entered. Mark hardly returned at all. The garage became his refuge, the roar of engines drowning out the presence of the man who had taken his father's place. When you caught glimpses of him, his eyes slid past you as though you were furniture, not blood. The child's fear hardened into certainty. She no longer cried when she saw you. She simply hid, as though you were nothing more than a shadow to be avoided. Her laughter rang bright only when you were absent. The home you had built had turned into a mausoleum, and you were its ghost. Outside, the whispers turned into accusations. Rumors spread like fire. Peter Baker had been consumed by Jackson, or worse, Peter had never returned at all. The butcher walked again, they said, and his family was cursed to harbor him. At the market, people no longer looked you in the eye. They watched from a distance, muttering, crossing themselves, pulling their children away. A boy once shouted after you, calling you monster, before his mother dragged him off. The isolation pressed in from all sides. You were alive, yet you no longer belonged anywhere. One evening, as twilight bled into night, you sat at the dinner table. Helen set down a modest plate, bread, vegetables, a small slice of meat. It should have been enough. But the butcher's body roared with hunger. You tore through the food quickly, the grease smearing your lips, your hands moving faster than you could restrain. When the plate was empty, the hunger remained. Your hand slammed against the table. The sound echoed like a gunshot, rattling the dishes. Helen froze, her eyes wide with fear. The child whimpered. Silence followed, heavy and suffocating. You stared at your trembling hand, horrified at the violence that had slipped through. That hand had once turned pages gently, lifted apples with care. Now it was a weapon, an instrument of Jackson's temper. Helen rose slowly, took the child by the hand, and left the room without a word. The sound of their footsteps on the stairs was louder than any accusation. You sat alone in the fading light, the house echoing with emptiness. That night, sleep abandoned you. You wandered the orchard under the pale glow of the moon. The trees whispered in the wind, their branches skeletal against the sky. And then the laughter came again, low, mocking, curling around you like smoke. You could not see Jackson, but you felt him. Felt his satisfaction at your weakness. "I told you," his voice rasped in your mind. "This body is mine. You can fight, but you are already losing. They know it. You know it." You pressed your hands over your ears, but the voice burrowed deeper, resonating inside your skull. You sank to your knees in the grass, chest heaving, tears burning your eyes. For the first time, you wondered not if you could resist, but how long it would take before you stopped trying. The tragedy was no longer distant. It had seeped into every corner of your life, into your home, your family, your very soul. Each day brought you closer to surrender, closer to the moment when you would no longer be Peter Baker, but nothing more than Jackson returned. And still, the world watched in silence, as though waiting for your final collapse. The days turned colder, though perhaps it was not the season that chilled you, but the hollow space growing inside your home. Helen moved about like a shadow, silent and deliberate. as though each sound might provoke the stranger sharing her house. She had not left you, but her presence had changed into something distant, something protective, more for the child than for herself. Mark rarely appeared now, his absences stretched into weeks. When he did return, his visits were brief, his voice clipped, his eyes refusing to linger on you. The bond had snapped completely. Whatever threads had tied father to son had unraveled into silence. And the child? Her laughter, once your brightest music, had vanished entirely in your presence. She hid whenever she heard your footsteps. Only after you left would she re-emerge, her giggles floating faintly through the walls like a memory of a world that no longer included you. You wandered through these rooms like an intruder. The photographs on the walls mocked you. They captured moments when Peter Baker had belonged here, his arm around Helen, his smile radiant beside Mark, his proud gaze as he held the child on the day she was born. Those images were proof of a man who had vanished, leaving behind only the shape of a butcher. One morning, you forced yourself into town, hoping to show that you could still belong, that you could still walk among the living. But the market was less forgiving than your home. People stopped and stared as you passed. Conversations hushed. A circle of whispers followed wherever you went. "That's him," someone murmured. "Not Peter. Never Peter." A group of men stood near a stall, their eyes narrowing as you approached. One smirked, his voice raised deliberately. "Look at him, walking curse in another man's skin." Something inside you snapped. Before thought could intervene, your hand seized the man by his collar, lifting him from the ground as though he were weightless. His legs kicked, his face reddened, his hands clawed at your grip. The crowd shouted. Some stepped forward, others back. Helen's cry split the air, sharp, desperate, pleading. In her voice was no recognition, only terror. You dropped the man. He crumpled to the ground, gasping for air while the crowd recoiled in horror. In their eyes, the verdict was sealed. This was no resurrection, no miracle. It was a monstrosity. You left with Helen clutching your arm, her tears streaming, her silence louder than words. The aftermath settled quickly. The family withdrew further into themselves. Meals became solitary affairs. Mark no longer entered the house. He slept in the garage or stayed away entirely. The child refused to eat if you sat at the table. Helen placed her plate far from yours, her gaze locked on her food, never on your face. The house was no longer home, but a battlefield of silences. Every creak of the floorboards, every breath you took seemed to tighten the air. One evening, Mark erupted. His voice broke through the stillness like thunder. He shouted that his father was gone, that the man before him was nothing but an imposter. His fist struck the wall, leaving a dent, before he stormed out into the night. The door slammed with finality, and the echo lingered long after his footsteps had vanished. Helen collapsed into tears, her body shaking, while the child sobbed into her arms. You stood in the doorway, motionless, powerless, suffocated by the truth. Nights became unbearable. Sleep, when it came, brought visions of slaughterhouses, rows of carcasses, the ring of cleavers against bone, the taste of iron on your tongue. You would wake drenched in sweat, the sheets twisted around you like restraints. The orchard, once your solace, now whispered mockery. The wind carried Jackson's laughter through the branches. You felt his presence pressing against your skin, sliding into your thoughts, claiming victory with every slip you made. "They see me," his voice curled within you. "Not you. They fear me, not you. And soon you will not even exist. You will fade, and I will remain." You clenched your fists,
whispered prayers, tried to anchor yourself in memories, Helen's smile, Mark's childhood laughter, the innocence of the grandchild. But each memory grew dimmer, each replaced by cravings, by anger, by violence that was not yours. One night, unable to endure the torment, you stood before the mirror in the hallway. The face staring back was thick-jawed, coarse, alien. Not Peter. Never Peter. The cracks in the glass fractured the reflection into dozens of Jacksons, all sneering, all laughing silently. Rage surged through you. Your fists struck the mirror. Shards rained down, slicing your skin. Blood trickled, yet the laughter remained, multiplying with every fragment. You pressed your forehead against the wall, whispering that you were Peter, that you still remained. But the words sounded hollow, even to yourself. Thus the tragedy deepened. You lived among those you loved, yet they no longer saw you. You struggled against the butcher's flesh, yet his instincts overwhelmed you. You spoke of identity, yet your own voice had become unrecognizable. You had not only lost your body, you had lost your place in the world. And still, the battle continued. Not for life, but for the fragments of self that remained.
The house had grown so silent that even the ticking of the old clock seemed like thunder. You drifted from room to room, your footsteps heavy, your presence unwanted. Helen avoided your gaze altogether, her eyes lowered to chores, her hands busy with tasks that needed no doing. The child laughed only in whispers now, and Mark had all but vanished from the home. Each night, when you lay down in Jackson's bloated body, the walls seemed to close in tighter. Shadows lengthened in the corners. Dreams carried you to slaughterhouses, to halls echoing with cleavers and bone, to markets where no one spoke your name. And always, behind the noise, the laughter of Jackson lingered, cruel and patient. You began to realize that this was no longer life. This was survival without purpose. To remain in Jackson's flesh was to rot slowly, day by day, until nothing of Peter Baker remained. One morning, unable to bear it, you set out toward the place you had once woken, the vast, sterile hall where clerks typed the names of the living and the dead. The orchard trees shivered as you passed, as though they sensed your intention. The road stretched longer than before, winding into landscapes that blurred between dream and memory. By the time you arrived, the hall looked exactly as it had the first time. Endless white corridors, clerks tapping keys, the sterile smell of inevitability. The silver-haired man awaited you, the same cold authority radiating from his frame. He did not appear surprised. Perhaps he had known you would return all along. Your voice emerged hoarse, but steady. You asked for your old body back, for the chance to be yourself again. The answer was immediate, final. Your former body had long since decayed, dissolved into dust and earth. Nature's law could not be reversed. To dwell in Jackson's flesh or to fade entirely, those were the only options. The words hit harder than any blow. You had known, perhaps, but hope had clung stubbornly, whispering of miracles. Now the truth was laid bare. You fell to your knees on the cold floor of the bureau. The The clerks continued their endless work, indifferent to your despair. The silver-haired figure did not move, did not soften. His face was carved from stone, his eyes fixed on duties larger than your suffering. Tears came unbidden. You realized that this place was not built for compassion. It was a factory of destiny, a machinery too vast to bend for a single soul. You were nothing more than a misfiled entry, a mistake that could not be corrected without breaking the system itself. And so the truth crystallized. To live in Jackson's flesh was to wear falsehood like a second skin. To fight it was futile. Each day eroded your soul, dragging you closer to the butcher's appetites, his tempers, his shadow. Living in such a lie was worse than death. When you returned, the sky had turned a steel gray. Leaves scattered across the road, swirling in winds that bit with winter's edge. You trudged home, each step heavier with the knowledge that nothing would change. Helen's eyes met yours briefly at the doorway. They flickered with sorrow, not love. She had hoped, perhaps, but hope too had withered. The child clung to her leg, watching you as one might watch a storm from behind glass. Mark did not appear at all. The home smelled of dust and silence. You sat in the old chair, the weight of Jackson pressing into the cushions, and felt the last fibers of your resistance fraying. That night, the butcher's voice grew stronger. It no longer whispered from afar, but rumbled inside your chest as though his soul had found permanent residence in your veins. "You see it now," he growled. "This body is mine. Your family knows it. The town knows it. Even you know it. You are not Peter Baker anymore. You never will be again." You wanted to scream denial, but the words choked in your throat. Deep down, you feared he was right. The path before you narrowed to two grim choices: to endure the lie, allowing Jackson to consume you piece by piece, or to surrender, to let go of the flesh that bound you, to dissolve into nothingness. Either way, the end of Peter Baker as the world had known him was inevitable. The days that followed your return from the bureau felt like walking through ash. Every sound was muted, every color dulled. Even the orchard, once alive with the red and gold of autumn, now seemed gray. Leaves fell around you like fragments of a life already gone, drifting silently into the soil. Helen moved about the house with careful precision, her eyes never lingering. She did what was necessary, prepared meals, cleaned, tended to the child, but her hands carried no warmth. She had built a barrier around herself, and you were forever outside of it. Mark no longer came home. His absence was total, his rejection absolute. And the child had grown accustomed to hiding whenever your shadow crossed the hall. The silence became unbearable. It was no longer simply the absence of sound, but the confirmation of your exile. You existed, but you did not belong. Jackson's influence grew daily. The cravings were stronger now, impossible to ignore. Your body sought food in excess, demanded drink, flared with anger over trifles. Each time you gave in, you felt the butcher's laughter vibrate in your chest. Sometimes, in the mirror, you thought you saw his reflection layered over yours, his mouth smirking where yours was still, his eyes glinting with malice where yours were hollow. "You will vanish soon," he whispered inside you. "One morning you'll wake and there will be no more Peter, only me, and no one will know the difference." The thought hollowed you further. Wasn't it already true? Didn't Helen already see only Jackson? Didn't the town already whisper of the butcher's return? Perhaps your soul was already fading, leaving nothing behind but a shell that belonged to another. One evening you walked into the orchard. The trees stood bare, their branches reaching like skeletal arms into the darkening sky. The wind rattled through them, a chorus of whispers. You placed your hand against the rough bark, searching for some echo of comfort. But the bark felt alien, the soil indifferent. These trees had known Peter, had grown under his care, had flourished with his touch. Now they seemed to reject you, their branches swaying as if to push you away. You sank to your knees in the grass, your chest heavy, your breath uneven. For the first time you admitted to yourself that you no longer belonged here. Not in this house, not in this town, not even in this body. That night, the bureau came to you again, not in waking, but in dream. You stood once more in its endless hall, the clerk still typing, the silver-haired figure still waiting. His eyes bore into you, unflinching. His words rang cold, inevitable. The choice remains, live the lie or surrender to truth. One path rots the soul, the other erases it. Choose. You woke with tears burning in your eyes, your hands clenched so tightly the knuckles ached. The words followed you into daylight. There would be no reprieve, no miracle. Helen must have sensed it too. One morning, as you stood in the doorway, she looked at you longer than usual. Her eyes glistened, not with love, but with a deep sorrow. She said nothing, yet you knew she understood. She had seen the truth. The man she loved was already half gone, slipping further each day. Her tears that night were softer, quieter, but they cut deeper than any scream. You found yourself returning to the orchard again and again, as though it were the only place vast enough to hold your despair. Each time Jackson's laughter accompanied you. Each time the branches whispered that you no longer belonged. And yet, beneath the despair, something else grew, a fragile clarity. Perhaps the only way to honor who you had been was to refuse to live this lie any longer. Perhaps the only dignity left was in surrender, in choosing truth over corruption. You began to understand, to continue in Jackson's flesh was not survival. It was slow death stretched across endless days, consuming everything you had been. But to let go, to step into the void, was to remain yourself in the only way left. Thus the choice sharpened into inevitability. Live in Jackson's flesh, a prisoner of another man's appetites, despised by your family, feared by the town, or surrender and dissolve into nothing, leaving only the memory of who you once were.
The air turned colder with each passing day. The orchard, stripped bare of leaves, stood like a graveyard of branches against the pale sky. The house itself felt heavier than ever, sagging under the weight of silence. You drifted through its rooms like a shadow, a guest where you once had been master. Helen's eyes no longer held anger or fear, only resignation. She moved through her days quietly, tending to the child, keeping the house, never raising her voice. Her silence was not empty. It was filled with the knowledge that Peter Baker was already gone. Mark did not return. The child clung only to her mother, her laughter rising only when you were not near. It was as if the world had already buried you. You existed, but you were no longer alive. Jackson's influence grew unbearable. His cravings were now indistinguishable from your own. Hunger for heavy meals consumed you. Thirst for alcohol burned your throat. Anger erupted in your veins before you could suppress it. Each time you surrendered, the butcher's laughter filled your chest. Each time you resisted, his presence pressed closer, mocking. You feared that soon there would be no distinction at all, that when you looked in the mirror, you would not even remember the face you once had. Your memories began to blur. Helen's smile on your wedding day, Mark's first steps, the orchard in bloom.
All of it flickered as though seen through smoke. What remained clear were not your memories, but Jackson's, the slaughterhouse, the knives, the endless red of blood. You realized then that you were not simply living in his flesh, you were becoming him. One evening, as twilight descended, you walked into the orchard. The wind was sharp, the sky streaked with the faint glow of dying light. The branches swayed above you, skeletal arms reaching upward, whispering in voices only you could hear. You touched the bark of one tree and closed your eyes. Memory stirred, the seasons of planting, the years of harvest, the sound of Helen's laughter among the blossoms, the way that Mark had once perched on your shoulders to pluck the reddest apple. Those memories felt fragile now, as though they belonged to someone else, a man long dead. And perhaps they did. You sank to your knees in the brittle grass. The world blurred with tears, but clarity cut through at last. You could not continue. To live as Jackson was to dishonor everything Peter Baker had been. To surrender was not defeat, but the only act of truth left. That night, the bureau returned in dream. The clerks typed endlessly. The silver-haired man stood unmovable, and the air vibrated with inevitability. This time, you did not beg. You did not plead for reversal. You only asked for dignity. To leave this false body behind. To end as yourself. The man inclined his head almost imperceptibly, as though acknowledging that at last you had understood. When you woke, the decision was no longer a question. It was already made. The next morning, you rose before dawn. The house was quiet, wrapped in shadows. Helen stirred in the kitchen. The child's soft breathing echoed from upstairs. You stood in the doorway for a long moment, memorizing the outlines of what you had loved. You did not speak. Words would have broken the fragile stillness. Instead, you let your gaze linger, hoping they might feel the weight of it in their hearts, that somewhere, beyond the butcher's shadow, they might still glimpse Peter one last time. Helen turned, and for the briefest second, her eyes softened, not in recognition, but in understanding. Tears welled, though she said nothing. She simply bowed her head, as though giving you permission. The child, half asleep, shuffled into the hall. She looked at you confused, not terrified this time, but distant. You smiled, a small, broken smile, and raised a hand. She clutched her doll tighter, but did not cry. Perhaps even she sensed that this was farewell. You stepped outside into the pale light of morning. The air was cold, sharp in your lungs. The orchard stretched before you, endless rows fading into mist. You walked among the trees, feeling the weight of the body lessening, as though the butcher's flesh was already releasing you. Each step brought you closer to the inevitable. You were no longer afraid. You had chosen truth, and in that choice, a strange peace began to bloom. The orchard awaited you, like a cathedral of silence. The trees stood tall and bare, their branches arching into the pale morning sky. Each step you took sank softly into the cold earth, the dew soaking through the boots that were not yours. Yet with every pace, the weight of Jackson's flesh seemed lighter, as though the body itself had begun to release its claim. You moved slowly, deliberately. The wind whispered through the branches like a hymn, a song of endings. You stopped in a clearing where the grass had thinned, where the sun broke weakly through the mist. You closed your eyes, and for the first time in weeks, you did not see Jackson's slaughterhouse or feel his hunger. Instead, you saw Helen's face as it had been when you were young, bright, hopeful, filled with the promise of days ahead. You saw Mark as a boy, running barefoot through these very rows, laughter spilling behind him like light. You saw the granddaughter, though not as she feared you now, but as she might one day remember you, if you let her. Not the butcher, but the man who had once loved her deeply. The visions blurred.
yet they steadied your resolve. These were the fragments worth preserving, not in flesh, but in memory. The decision had already been made, but now it became action. You sank to your knees in the frost-kissed grass, tilted your head back to the sky, and exhaled slowly. The breath that left you felt heavier than all the rest, carrying with it the last remains of resistance. The body trembled. The butcher's hunger flared one final time, rage pulsing through muscles that did not want to release you. But your will had grown stronger than his cravings. You pressed your palms against the earth and whispered, not aloud, but deep within, "I am Peter Baker, and I choose to end as myself." The trembling ceased. The weight in your chest loosened. The world grew brighter, sharper, not through the butcher's eyes, but through your own. And then, piece by piece, the body dissolved around you. Flesh became mist, bone became dust, breath became silence. You felt no pain, only release. As the orchard shimmered around you, you turned once more toward the house. Helen stood at the doorway, the child clutched to her hip. She could not see you, not fully, but perhaps she sensed something in the air, the way the wind shifted, the way the morning light deepened. Her eyes glistened, and though her lips did not move, you knew she was saying goodbye. The child stirred, lifting her head. For the briefest moment, her eyes widened, not in fear, but in wonder, as if she too felt the brush of a presence she could not name. She reached out a tiny hand toward the orchard. You wished you could take it, but you knew this was enough. You turned away, carrying their images with you, the sorrow, the love, the fleeting understanding. You stepped deeper into the mist, your form thinning, your edges dissolving. The orchard faded, the house receded, the sky opened into boundless white. The laughter of Jackson was gone, silenced forever. What remained was a quiet, pure, and absolute. Your final thought was not of despair, but of truth, that a man cannot live a borrowed life without losing himself, that happiness exists only where body and soul walk in harmony, that dignity lies not in clinging, but in letting go. And then, you were gone. The orchard stood silent. The wind moved through its branches. In time, the seasons would turn again. Spring blossoms, summer fruit, autumn harvest, winter frost. Helen would endure. Mark would carry on. The child would grow. They would remember Peter Baker, not as a butcher, not as a monster, but as a man who had chosen truth at the cost of everything. And in that memory, you would live on.